So thanks for the great warm-up act. I have to say he was preaching to the choir, but I think that was a faultless performance. Hard to think of what he could have said differently that would have been a better way of putting the Travis era behind him and coming forward. I have to say he had a rather easier job than I think the tech industry has as a whole in restoring its reputation. And I'm going to speak here a few minutes of what I think the challenges are that the tech industry is going to face over the next maybe 10, 20, 30 years as it tries to carve out a constructive and positive role in society. I must say these are personal opinions. I've only been at the Rockefeller Foundation about 4 days, and so too early to have Rockefeller views. But these are really based on, I guess, reflections on what I've heard over the last couple of days here, but also writing about the positive role that business can play potentially in society in my book Philanthrocapitalism, which came out about 10 years ago, and how that whole process has evolved. What I would say, and I do apologize in advance if I appear to be channeling Scott Galloway, because I missed his talk this morning, but knowing Scott, it was brilliant and provocative, and so I hope I can at least manage that. This is not a temporary mood swing against tech. This is not a period where we're going from techno-utopianism to a temporary period of technophobia. This is a paradigm shift moment. This is a moment where, for the next 20, 30, 40 years, the tech industry is going to be under growing public scrutiny, and the challenge for tech's leaders is going to be to have convincing answers to the questions the public are going to be bringing. If you read the latest edition of my former publication, The Economist, you will see a whole series of articles on the new titans and how to tame them. And The Economist basically coins this new phrase that basically the tech sector is bad, BAADD, which stands for big, anti-competitive, addictive, and damaging to democracy. Those are the four charges that it faces, and I think those are going to continue to be very interesting charges, and I'm going to talk about them as we go forward. Big, first of all. It's clear that the size of the companies we're talking about, the big tech leaders, is bigger than capitalism has ever produced before. That there is a natural public skepticism about anything that powerful and that large. And tech is also caught in the general growing skepticism about the 1% and how much power is in the hands of the wealthy few. And so many of the entrepreneurs who build these companies are billionaires or multi-billionaires. And it's being caught up in the general decline of trust in institutions. You will have heard that the Edelman Trust Barometer found that in America, trust in all institutions fell by 14% over the last year from already historically low levels. Trust in business is down 10%. Even the trust in media is down 5%. So you're caught up in a broad public backlash against big. Secondly, the anti-competitiveness arguments. Clearly, I think we are seeing very strong echoes of the robber baron era, the trust-busting era of the late 1880s through to the early 20th century in America, and which produced the antitrust actions there and the progressive movement, but also saw in Europe the rise of socialism and very anti-business policies. And we could be, I think, over the next decade or two, see the emergence of similar currents of thinking and political activism that will echo that period. What's interesting to me is that that period took a very long time. What you saw was initially a public concern about the scale and power and methods of these big trusts, and then that evolved through the academic community into a set of sophisticated policies for holding those companies to account. It took a very long time. Henry Demarest produced his book, The Great Monopoly, about Standard Oil in 1881, but it wasn't until 1911 that the company was actually broken up by the Supreme Court into 34 pieces. So that's the kind of period, even with internet time, I think we're looking at decades rather than just a year to fix it, as the head of Facebook put it in his letter at the start of the year. This is a long-term problem. And if you look at what's going on in academia at the moment, particularly amongst economists, you will see that what was probably a half a century of dismissing basically the whole case for anti-monopoly regulation, you're now seeing a resurgence of interest in the case for antitrust. You're seeing arguments that the movements against, say, IBM and AT&T and Microsoft actually were pro-innovation in the American economy. You're seeing the American Enterprise Institute, a very conservative business organization, holding panel discussions about should you break up Amazon, Facebook, and so forth. You're seeing Chicago University economists advocating for social graph portability rules to be brought in as a pro-competitive measure. This stuff is only beginning, and I think we're going to see more and more economists thinking this is how they make their career, by coming up with clever, tech-savvy solutions to some of these big questions about too much monopoly power in these firms. We are going to hear more about the breakup arguments, although I think those are probably a more crude approach. They may be politically very attractive arguments. It's going to be much more around how do we manage initially to create more competitiveness through such things as social graph portability. But you're also, I think, going to see a huge concern that what we've seen already through the natural monopoly externalities, network effects that have created these big companies, that we're going to see that AI is going to have an effect of making what we've seen so far orders of magnitude more intense. So there's a kind of parable of the talents about AI, that those who have it and have the most of it are likely to build bigger and bigger leads against all their competitors. And so, I think you're going to see more and more concern about the concentration of the leading AI research in the hands of the very companies that are actually already asserting the most monopoly power. So, and you're going to start, Theodore Roosevelt, the leader of the progressive movement, came up with this phrase, malefactors of great wealth. I think you're going to hear about malgorithms a lot over the next period as we see these algorithms that actually have harm and bias and make things worse. Maybe algopolists, the firms that control the algorithms. These are going to be perennial concerns. And then the addictive element of the Economist's bad phrase. I don't know. I mean, I have a 4-year-old. I can't get the iPhone off the 4-year-old. I don't know whether that's medically demonstrable as harm, but I know quite a few American class action lawyers who would, be hoping there's evidence that, brain damage is being done, or the brain synapses or whatever are being created in ways that are quite harmful for our kids getting exposed to that. No wonder you're getting California State Teachers Pension Fund and hedge funds like Jana actually demanding that Apple actually do some research on this. If you look at the history of tobacco and now, in fact, oil, where you're seeing that research was done and suppressed by those companies, I reflect on all these conversations over the last 10 years I've had with people at Facebook and Google and others about all these experiments they've done with their data. Day after day, hundreds and hundreds of experiments, some of them 100-year experiments. So I don't know what they've been researching, but the lawyers are going to try and find out. And I would be, if I were those companies, I would be thinking very hard about the evidence I have and I've suppressed because it was inconvenient. And I would be doing a lot of things to put myself on the right side of the public argument there. As for the final one of damaging democracy, I hope and suspect that the fake news thing is going to be a sort of blip in this debate. And the real debate is the filter bubble argument, that there's something inherent in these advertising-led, algorithm-centric, personalized services that basically is essentially selling an addictive drug to the user. And that even if your family and friends are filtering your news, that isn't necessarily going to open you up to a wide range of diverse opinion that you might want to be underpinning a democratic debate. So good on Facebook for moving in that direction, but I think until we can come up with an answer to the filter bubble problem and this contribution that these news media companies are making to our tribalism and isolation from each other, we're in a lot of trouble. Now, what do I think has to happen? And this is clearly an extremely difficult challenge. Reading the Google IPO letter from Sergey and Larry, with its declaration to do no evil and the hope that philanthropy by Google would outweigh its impact that the company has, it feels like a different, more naive era to what you see, at least in Zuckerberg's letter at the start of the year, where he does at least recognize that he's got to grapple with understanding of history, civics, political philosophy, media, government, and technology. And I do hope that we have more leaders like Dara in the tech sector who are capable of doing that very in-depth wrestling with those complex philosophical questions and intellectual questions, particularly as they have to apply that across many different countries around the world. I also worry that this can't just be a top-down approach, and I like the effort by DJ Patel, the former, I think, CTO of the US, who's trying to get an ethics code taught to coders in graduate school, because you've got to get the people writing the algorithms to have some appreciation of the context in which they're operating and the sort of civic norms and so forth. I would like to see these leaders double down on the kind of do the right thing message that we just heard from Uber. I think they need to actually think very hard about how they embrace certain types of regulation that may, in the short term, be harmful to their companies, but in the long term will be in their enlightened self-interest. Like, I do think they should be making social graph portability something that they do make available. That will increase the possibility of competition, even though I think if they're as good as they seem to be, they will continue to retain advantages. I think they need to recognize that they are increasingly the public space of the societies we live in and the global society, and they ought to start actually importing into that public space many of the norms that in the West we take for granted, whether that be concerns about privacy, and certainly it ought to be about trying to underpin the democratic systems that gave birth to those companies. And I'd like to see, for example, Facebook appoint the equivalent of the New York Times public editor who can come in and actually respond to reader complaints. I'd like to see Apple actually set up a commission to look into, a clearly independent commission to look into these health complaints. I'd like to see tech leaders take seriously the future of work and creating jobs, not opt out into saying there won't be any jobs. We have to give people a universal basic income, which is just nonsense. And finally, I think this is all set in the context of these big Western tech companies taking on Chinese tech companies that are increasingly powerful and reflect uniquely Chinese values. And I would like to see the competitive response from those Western companies to be to compete on Western values, to be representatives of the values of the society that gave birth to them, rather than going head-to-head in Chinese values. I have no idea what that means in practice. That's going to be a question for the next 10 or 20 years, but that ought to be the starting point. And these leaders are idealists, I think, so let them be idealistic in the spirit of Western values and start a real debate and engagement with us here and more broadly in the public about what that should do to our capitalism and our leading representatives of capitalism. My time is up. Thank you very much.